If you have ever been teaching a pose to a student, a group of students, and they're just not getting what it is that you're saying, you've tried to say it in a bunch of different ways, they're just not picking up what you're putting down, it is likely because you have not introduced that concept in your class in enough diverse ways prior to you introducing it in that pose. So I'm going to share with you today a sequencing tip that will bring not only a lot of diversity and variety into your classes, but it will address this very common obstacle that we face as teachers. You can have students in a pose and you can be explaining something, some sort of cue or some sort of specific alignment or action or engagement that you would like them to take. And you can explain it in a bunch of different ways, and there's going to be people who are just not getting what you're saying. And this can feel really frustrating as a teacher. Obviously, we know as teachers, we're not going to get everyone, and that's not the point. And it's going to land with different people at different times. But there is one thing that you can do in your sequencing that will massively help your students understand this. By doing this thing, it does most of the work for you. It does most of the heavy lifting, so that by the time you get to the point in a pose where you're cueing your students or you're instructing them or guiding them to pay attention to this one specific thing that you're wanting them to do, it's not so hard for them to understand. It feels a lot more familiar to them, and they themselves will end up feeling a lot more confident. You as a teacher will see how much more impactful your teaching will be with this kind of sequencing tip. So the example that I'm going to utilize today is the engagement and the action of drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. In whatever pose you want to, think that goes into, that's just the action that I am going to use as an example today. So we will use it in the lead up to a specific pose, but for now, I'm just going to speak about it in its most simple, isolated form. So if I am waiting until a more complex or demanding pose to introduce this concept to my students, of course, most of them are not going to get it. Number one being because there's a lot of other things going on in a pose on top of that action. So a lot of our students are kind of just trying to survive. They're trying to figure it out. They're trying to breathe. They're trying to figure out, do I do this thing that way? Am I doing this correct? Oh, what's that person doing over there? There's a lot of distraction. And then when they're doing a pose where there are a lot of layers, to get them to focus on this one specific thing often means that it's just too much for them. So this is why in our sequence, if we begin to incorporate this type of, as I said, the example today that I'm using is the pubic bone to belly button action. If we incorporate that at different times in different ways before we ever get to the point where it's needed in the pose, then your students are going to get it. So that's one reason why they're not really picking up what you're putting down, because they're kind of overwhelmed. There's a lot going on. Another reason why they might not really be understanding is because perhaps the orientation of the pose or the angle of the pose or the way in which gravity is playing a role on the body during that pose that you want them to do this thing means that they can't connect it to it. They don't know how to connect to it. Remember that we all learn in different ways. So just like learning styles, some people are going to learn better when they're listening to something. Some people are going to do better when they're reading something. Some people are going to do better when they're actually physically doing it with their bodies. Some people need that visual connection. We are all different. And so you really need to introduce the same type of concept or action that you would like your students to engage in this pose. You need to do it in a lot of different ways because not everyone is going to get the same type of awareness by doing that thing in the pose. So again, let's go back to the pubic bone to belly button example. So when you have your students, let's say, start of the class, and you know that you're going to take them to a place where it's really important in that pose that they are focusing on drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. And it's important for them to maintain that throughout the duration of the pose. You want to introduce that in as many different ways, as many different angles as you possibly can before they ever get to that pose. You can start, for example, having them lying down on the back, and you can get them to feel the connection of pubic bone drawing to belly button. You can get them to feel and cue how the lower back presses into the ground. You can get them to connect with how we're shortening the distance between the pubic bone and the belly button. You can get them to place their fingertips onto the front of the hips and their thumbs onto the lower portion of the ribs and say, draw those 2 points closer towards each other. So these are all different ways that essentially are achieving the same thing, which is drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. So there's one example when your students are lying down. Maybe you're doing this from a seated position and you're really wanting them to feel that in a seated position. Perhaps you're getting them to go through a little bit of a cat-cow from a seated position, and you're getting them to move into the cat position while they're seated via the action and the intention of drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. And then in doing so, they start to naturally move into that cat position. So again, there is one way you can speak to expanding and creating spaciousness through the lower back area. And again, that will give the same result as drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. So there are, again, different ways. Maybe you're doing this from a kneeling position on the hands and knees during a cat-cow. And perhaps you're really getting your students to focus on that engagement of drawing pubic bone to belly button. Perhaps you're shifting them into a kneeling position where they are standing upright. And again, you're just getting them to create spaciousness in the lower back, draw the pubic bone to the belly button. You know, none of these things are really like poses per se. Yes, they're typical movements, but they're not necessarily poses that have other layers in them. So it's easier for your students to get it, for it to land, for them to understand. Again, you can do this in a standing position. Maybe you're getting your students to go into a wide-legged stance. Maybe they're just standing with their feet hip width distance or something like that, and feel the movement of the pelvis. Feel where they draw the pubic bone to the belly button and then where they release it and how that makes a difference. You can get them to move through this while they are even on their bellies. So there are lots of different ways that you can get your students to experience this type of action before you ever introduce it. Now, the other thing that really matters when you use this kind of approach in your sequencing is to consider the fact that when we add layers on top of this action already, again, going back to the example of pubic bone to belly button, when we start to add some other things on top of that, that might make it difficult for our students to maintain that connection, that is where we begin to build them. That's the progression part of your sequencing, the invitation, the awareness for them to see, this is something that I can do. But when I start to add another layer of action on top of that, it might be compromised. It might be harder for me to do that. So let's go back to the example of lying down and drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. Is get your students to begin to layer that movement. So while they're lying down, they've drawn the pubic bone to the belly button, you now begin to add a little arm movement or a little lift of the hips slightly higher while they're trying to maintain that action of keeping the pubic bone to the belly button. So what you're doing is you're gradually layering and you're presenting these additions in a slow, gradual way, which allows your students to be able to view what is needed for them to maintain that action. So you're not just introducing it in isolation and then you're throwing it all together when you do the pose. You are gradually adding layers. So for example, if you're doing this from a standing position and let's say you have the legs in a pyramid position. You have one leg forward and one leg back, and you're really getting your students to feel that action of drawing the pubic bone towards the belly button. And then from there, you're adding maybe a little spinal extension, or maybe you're adding a little bit of a twist. So you're layering things so that by the time they get to doing the pose where you're feeling like, hey, my students aren't generally picking up what I'm putting down. They're not really listening when I'm giving them this cue. They have more embodied experience in different ways, in different angles and orientations, and as I said, laying down, sitting, standing, all these different ways, so that they're gradually building these things up and their awareness is definitely enhanced. So that's what I mean when I say it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, so that by the time you get them to the point, and I'm going to use the example now of camel pose, by the time you would get them into camel pose and you want them to connect to maintaining the pubic bone towards the belly button, they've already done it a bunch of other times in a lot of other positions, both in isolation and where it's been layered underneath of other things. They've felt what it feels like to maintain that. So that's what I mean when I say a lot of the heavy lifting will already be done. You're going to get them into camel pose and they're going to be so much more aware of maintaining that drawing of pubic bone towards belly button, and they're going to be aware of what pulls them away from that. So they might go into a lot of this spinal extension, and then they're starting to feel, oh, this is where I'm really letting it go. So this is a tip that you can utilize for any kind of action, engagement, thing that you feel like your students just aren't getting. Introduce it in isolation at various points in your sequence, in different ways, with different angles, with different kinds of cues, and then gradually layer it so that by the time you get to putting it into a pose that is a bit more demanding, your students aren't sitting there going, I can't, I don't know how, I don't know what you're saying, I can't make the connection. They're really able to be more empowered, they're more connected, and you as a teacher will feel so much more effective within your job of helping them. If this really resonated with you and it's something that you want to learn more about and you want help with developing in your teaching, just go to the description of this video and you'll see below there's a link to book a call with me. You can also reach out to me via DM on my Instagram page. I would love to connect with you and see where I may be able to support you to develop these things in your teaching and make a bigger impact with those that you guide.